Picture the mid-19th century. Gas lamps illuminate the platform, and you are boarding a train for the first time in your life that will carry you through the night. You do not know what awaits you, because no one really knows yet. Your grandfather traveled by stagecoach and slept at coaching inns. Your father journeyed by carriage and stopped at hotels. And now you are about to go to a place where sleep and motion will fuse into an experience unlike anything before. What happens to a person when the ground slips away beneath their feet at about 32 kilometers an hour? And you must sleep, here and now, inside this rattling iron monster. When, in the 1830s, the first railway lines began to be laid across Europe and America, no one gave much thought to night travel. The railway was conceived as a daytime delight, an attraction of speed and progress. The earliest routes were short, from Liverpool to Manchester, from St. Petersburg to Tsarskoye Selo. Getting there and back within the daylight hours seemed a perfectly sensible plan. But very quickly, within a few years, appetites grew. People wanted to link London with Edinburgh, Moscow with St. Petersburg, New York with Chicago. Then it turned out that a journey did not take 3 hours, but 20. What was a passenger to do who had set out in the morning and by evening discovered that another 12 hours of jolting lay ahead? Hello, I'm Daniel Hayes, and welcome to Lectures Under the Moon. The first attempts to sleep on trains were, to say the least, heroic. First-generation carriages looked more like road coaches mounted on rails. The same rigid wooden benches, the same narrow windows. Only the shaking was fundamentally different. In a coach, you rocked smoothly, like in a cradle, however uncomfortable. Horse hooves, springs, a soft dirt road. These created a certain rhythm. On a train, it was iron on iron, joints between rails that had not yet been welded into a single ribbon. The carriage jumped, lurched, crashed in such a way that it sounded as if a blacksmith were hammering horseshoes inside. Early passengers described it as torture. One English gentleman wrote in his diary in 1839, "I tried to doze off, but every knock of the wheels reverberated along my spine as if someone was striking me with a stick across my back." People adapted quickly. Within a couple of years, regular night runs developed their own tricks and practices. Seasoned travelers brought pillows, not small cushions, but real feather pillows from home. They placed them under their heads, under their sides, wedged them between themselves and the carriage wall to soften the blows. Women carried shawls, many shawls. They wrapped themselves, made improvised bolsters, covered and tucked. Men, especially those of more modest means, pulled overcoats over their heads and tried to will themselves to sleep. Back then, attitudes toward sleeping on the move were different. For a 19th century person, sleep was tied to stillness, to shelter, to a protected space. A bedroom, a bed with a canopy, heavy drapes at the windows, that was where a respectable person slept. To fall asleep in public, in sight of strangers, and while in motion, seemed improper to many. Some feared it was dangerous to their health. Physicians of the era debated seriously whether sleep on a train could harm the brain or disrupt the body's natural rhythms. Medical journals even published warnings about the hazard of railway sleep, arguing that constant vibration could lead to nervous disorders, that a person who regularly slept on trains might become irritable and lose their reason. Those fears were fed by the reality that trains were genuinely dangerous in those days. Accidents happened with some regularity. A rail might split, a bridge might fail, the locomotive might derail. To fall asleep on a train was to entrust your life to a machine and to the hands of the crew. What if something happened while you slept? What if a fire broke out and you could not escape? Such fears were not unfounded. Wooden coaches, illuminated by kerosene lamps and warmed by stoves, did indeed burn like matches. Many passengers therefore refused to sleep on night trains as a matter of principle, preferring to stay awake the whole way, reading by the dim lamplight or simply staring into the darkness outside the window. The most surprising thing began only when people finally fell asleep. It turned out that sleep on a train was a special condition. It was neither the deep sleep in one's own bed nor a doze in an armchair. It was something else. The clack of the wheels established a monotonous rhythm that, strangely enough, soothed. The rocking of the carriage, though abrupt at times, still had its own periodicity. The body gradually learned to predict those motions. Muscles relaxed, and a new culture of sleep slowly took shape. A railway sleep culture, with its own rules and traditions. The first attendants quickly understood that night passengers were a distinct category. They arrived exhausted, irritable, desperately in need of comfort. Railway companies began to respond. At first, timidly, came carriages with slightly softer seats. Then benches were made with backs. Then someone realized that a backrest could be tilted back so a person could at least stretch a little. Each such improvement was hailed as a revolution in comfort. By the end of the 1840s, it had become clear that a night train was not simply a train that ran at night. It was a special space that required special conditions. Then came the interesting part, a struggle over the quality of a passenger's sleep. Companies understood that whoever could guarantee their passengers proper night rest would gain a competitive advantage. People would pay extra not for speed, but for the chance to sleep. Arriving exhausted was impractical. Between 1845 and 1850, a real race of innovation began. Each railway company tried to invent something of its own, something special. Curtains between seats appeared, creating at least the illusion of privacy. Gas illumination that could be dimmed at night was introduced, so it would not disturb sleepers. There were even experimental carriages with suspended bunks. Those were soon abandoned because, under sudden braking, passengers simply flew out of those improvised hammocks. Above all, people grew used to the idea. What had once seemed impossible to their parents became commonplace. Young people of the 1850s already regarded the night train as a normal part of life. They learned to sleep to the wheel clack, to ignore a snoring neighbor, and to adapt to dozing half upright while clutching their carpet bag. A new type of traveler was emerging, a person of the railway age, for whom sleep on the road became as natural as sleep at home. Romance aside, reality was far harsher. One can become accustomed to anything, but that does not mean it was comfortable. Not at all. To truly understand what those first night passengers endured, we must look inside those carriages, examine what they had to spend their sleepless nights on, touch those wooden benches where no comfortable position could be found, smell the kerosene fumes from the lamps that seeped into clothing, and feel how legs went numb after 8 hours of sitting in one pose. That raw, unvarnished truth about the first night trains is what we are about to talk about. Imagine a carriage of the year 1845, a wooden box about 12 meters long and about 3 meters wide on wheels. Inside, 2 long benches ran along the walls, facing one another. The wood was, of course, not polished, but merely planed. One could easily get a splinter if one ran a careless hand along the back. That, of course, depended on the class of the carriage and the company's generosity. In the best case, there was a wooden board set at a right angle to the seat. No tilt, no lumbar support. Simply a vertical surface to lean against if one really wanted to. Imagine having to sit on such a hard bench for 10 hours. Not merely sit. Try to fall asleep. During the first hour, you manage. Your back is straight, your posture dignified. The second hour brings a creeping discomfort. By the third hour, your buttocks begin to go numb, because wood is wood. There is no softness. At the 5th hour, you would give half your fortune for a pillow. At the 7th, for the mere chance to lie down. By the 10th hour of travel, you are no longer quite human, but a battered creature experimenting with every conceivable and inconceivable pose in search of anything bearable. Experienced travelers knew secrets. The main rule: never board a night train without your own pillow. A pillow was not a luxury, but an item of first necessity. It could be tucked behind the back, under the side, beneath the head. People wedged it between themselves and the carriage wall to create the illusion of cushioning. Some cunning ones carried 2 pillows, one for the seat, another for the head. Women were more practical than men in this regard. They arrived with whole bundles of gear: shawls, plaids, travel blankets, small reticules, and rightly so, for all of it came in handy. Still, a pillow solved only part of the problem. The harder question remained: how to sleep at all while sitting up? If you've never tried napping upright for hours, you can't grasp how hard it is. The head keeps folding forward, the neck grows stiff, the jaw slackens, and drooling begins. Not exactly romantic. Some tried to tilt the head back, but then a different part of the neck ached. The mouth gaped wider, and snoring grew thunderous. The most inventive improvised a broad leather strap or a scarf, wrapping it around the head and fastening it to the luggage rack overhead. The result looked comical, but worked. A makeshift brace that kept the head from falling. At least the neck did not seize up so badly. In the morning, a red mark often remained across the brow from the strap, but that was a small price for several hours of relative peace. Now imagine you're not traveling alone. The carriage is packed shoulder to shoulder, knee to knee. The distance between benches is less than 1 meter. Your feet are constantly touching the feet of the person opposite. If that person is tall, you have nowhere to put your legs and must cross them into awkward knots. Suppose the person across from you falls asleep. Their head tips forward and lands on your knee. What can you do? Push them away? That would be rude. Endure it? That is almost impossible. Herein lies the social drama of Victorian travel. Lighting added its own character to the scene. Kerosene lamps, perhaps 1 or 2 for the whole carriage, cast a dim, flickering glow that threw monstrous shadows. Soot collected on the ceiling in black streaks. The smell of kerosene mingled with the odors of unwashed bodies, tobacco, and food. By journey's end, the air inside the carriage was thick and stale, a suffocating atmosphere that brought headaches. You could open a window to air it, but then smoke from the locomotive chimney and sparks of coal dust would fly into your face. The choice between stifling heat and coal-smudged breath was the nightly passenger's dilemma. The real interest began when class entered the picture. For even in those harsh times, comfort had a hierarchy. Third class was what I have just described: bare wooden benches, minimal light, maximum crowding. Workers, small traders, peasants traveling for seasonal work crammed in there. They slept as they could, often literally on top of one another, forming a heap of bodies to retain warmth. Modesty yielded to exhaustion. The main hope was not to tumble off the bench when the train took a sharp turn. Second class was a little more merciful. The benches were the same, but came with backrests. There was slightly more space per passenger, and sometimes cushions on the seats, horsehair stuffed into canvas. It was not comfortable exactly, but tolerable. The clientele was more respectable. Minor clerks, school teachers, impecunious shopkeepers. People there made an effort at propriety. Men removed their hats. Women adjusted their skirts. Daniel Hayes, lectures under the moon. They did their best to hold back, though by 3 o'clock in the morning all those social proprieties were being thrown to the winds. And first class, first class of the 1840s. Do not rush to imagine gilded luxury. It was still a wooden coach with the same windows and the same clatter, only the benches were upholstered in velvet or leather. The backs were tilted back slightly, by about 5 degrees perhaps, but that was a breakthrough. There was more space between seats. You could stretch your legs without jabbing your neighbor. Lamps were brighter, the air cleaner, the clientele chosen. In first class rode aristocrats, wealthy industrialists, the highest officials. They arrived with servants who carried large portmanteaus filled with travel accoutrements. From those trunks came small wonders of comfort: traveling robes, soft slippers, nightcaps, even portable writing desks. The servants spread fur throws, arranged pillows, brought steaming tea from the buffet car in flasks. Yes, by modern standards the conditions were still Spartan, but alongside third class, this felt like paradise. The wealthiest passengers went further and ordered a private compartment, a small cabin for 4 to 6 people with a locking door. It cost the equivalent of 3 first-class tickets, but it bought precious privacy. One could take off a jacket, unlace a corset, lie full length on a bench. True, the bench was still short, and legs often had to be propped up on the opposite seat, but such details were trifles. Remarkably, a whole industry of travel contrivances sprang up. Enterprising merchants quickly realized there was money to be made from passengers' suffering. Shops stocked special travel pillows and long bolsters to wrap around the neck, inflatable rubber cushions that were pumped up and tucked under the back or head, folding footrests and wooden hinged frames that could be unfolded between seats, and travel blankets made of camel hair, light, warm, compact. Entire catalogs offered serious-sounding advice to travelers. Be sure to take a small bottle of smelling salts in case of stuffiness. Do not forget spare handkerchiefs. They will protect you from smoke. We recommend taking rusks and apples. Light food will not burden the stomach during sleep. Some suggestions were utterly absurd. Tie your luggage to your wrist with a rope so it will not be stolen while you sleep. Imagine the scene. A person sleeps while a suitcase is tied to their wrist. Women suffered doubly. Corsets prevented deep breathing. Crinoline skirts took up so much room that sitting properly was nearly impossible. Decency required keeping the legs together and the back straight, even when sleep was desperately needed. Many women simply did not sleep on night trains. They sat up straight all night, afraid to let their heads fall and appear indecent. Only by morning, when exhaustion finally took hold, did they allow themselves to close their eyes, leaning against a companion's shoulder or the carriage wall. By the end of the 1840s, a typical night traveler had a recognizable look: rumpled, eyes red, limbs numb, a headache from the stuffiness and kerosene fumes. He would stagger from the coach and head straight for a hotel where a proper bed awaited. A night on the train was not considered real sleep. It was survival, a way to hold on until the end of the journey. All of this in the warm months. Winter told a different story, when the discomfort of hard benches was joined by a bone-piercing cold. When windows were rimed with frost on the inside and breath turned to mist. When passengers shivered so violently that sleep was impossible even if they had wanted it. That was another chapter entirely. The story of how people tried to preserve warmth and life inside a wooden box, rushing through a winter night. In winter, the problem went beyond mere discomfort. The cold made sleeping not only unpleasant, but genuinely dangerous. A real, penetrating cold in a wooden coach hurtling through the frozen dark. The wooden coach of 1845 was, in truth, a shed on wheels. Gaps yawned between the boards, letting the wind whistle through. Windows had single panes that kept almost no warmth. The floorboards were poorly fitted, and cold rose up through them from the ground. On top of all this, the coach raced along at about 40 versts an hour, roughly 42 kilometers per hour, bringing an extra stream of icy air through every crack. Early railway companies did not think about heating at all. Really, they assumed that because a journey lasted only a few hours, passengers would manage, put on a warm coat and be fine. That logic worked in summer and autumn, but when the first true frosts arrived, -20 to -25 degrees Celsius, it became clear that no coat would save you. Travelers arrived at their destinations with serious health consequences. Some lost toes to the cold, others suffered frostbitten ears and noses. One of the earliest recorded incidents of mass health problems happened in the winter of 1842, on the line between St. Petersburg and Moscow. A train stuck in snowdrifts for 6 hours while the temperature outside was -32 degrees Celsius. There was no heating whatsoever in the coaches. By the time rescuers dug the train out and brought it to a station, many passengers needed urgent medical assistance. After that disaster, the imperial government issued an order. All passenger coaches must have heating during the winter months. Implementing that requirement was easier said than done. The first technical solution was simple and hazardous: potbelly stoves. These iron stoves, fueled with coal or wood, were installed in the center or in a corner of the coach, with a pipe running up through the roof. It seemed solved until the dangers appeared. A roaring hot iron stove inside a wooden coach, packed with people in heavy wool clothing, was a very unstable combination. Fires started regularly. Sometimes someone would shovel in too much coal, the stove would glow red, and the wooden floor would begin to smolder. Under a sudden stop, embers could fly out of the stove's open door onto the floor. Sparks escaped through loose joints and set something alight. In the winter of 1845 in England, 12 passenger coaches suffered damage in one season because of stoves. Panicked passengers spilled out of smoke-filled cars at stations. Even when fire was avoided, the stove created its own set of problems. Heat from it distributed extremely unevenly. Those sitting next to the stove gasped from the heat, took off their coats, unbuttoned shirts, and fanned themselves with handkerchiefs. At the distant end of the same coach, people still watched their breath puff out in the air as steam. A single coach, therefore, contained two climate zones at once: tropical warmth by the stove and Arctic cold by the doors. Arguments followed. Passengers who were freezing demanded more coal. Those suffocating by the fire demanded that it be damped down or that windows be opened. Conductors were pulled in both directions. Loud disputes and mutual accusations were common. A civilized 19th century, by one measure, could be very noisy. The problem was compounded by the stove's appetite for fuel. A stove needed constant feeding. At stations, a conductor would leap into the coach with a bucket of coal and shove it into the fire. But when stations lay far apart, the coal ran out, the stove cooled, and the cold returned. Passengers pounded on the service compartment door, demanding that the fire be rekindled. Sometimes anything that burned went into the stove: wooden crates, luggage, even books and newspapers. Practical travelers prepared for winter journeys. Along with warm clothing, they took heat sources of their own. Not electric, of course, because those did not yet exist. There were two types of portable warmers: metallic and ceramic. The metallic warmer was a flat flask filled with boiling water. Passengers filled it at a station, wrapped it in a towel, and tucked it under their feet or pressed it to their belly. The warmth lasted for about 3 hours. Afterward, the metal grew cold. Ceramic warmers were more interesting. Flat clay vessels with a lid, inside which one placed hot stones or specially made fuel tablets that smoldered slowly and emitted heat. A ceramic warmer could give warmth for about 5 hours, but it too carried danger. Daniel Hayes, Lectures Under the Moon. If it was packed the wrong way, you could be scalded through your clothes. If it fell, it shattered into 1,000 pieces, and the glowing embers spilled across the floor. The most popular way to keep warm, above all else, was a hot brick. Simple, cheap, and effective. At stations, for a small fee, you could get a brick kept in the stove until it was white hot. It was wrapped in several layers of newspaper or rags and handed to the passenger. The brick was placed at the feet and would heat for 2 or 3 hours. The only vital rule was not to forget it on the floor when you got off. Otherwise, you would find yourself burnt. Third-class passengers sometimes pooled their money for a single brick. They put it in the middle of the carriage and warmed their feet by it in turn. Fur blankets and throws belonged to the better-off travelers. Bear, wolf, even sable pelts and hides were all pressed into service. Wrap yourself up under one of those, head and all, and you could survive a hard frost. Breathing under the fur was difficult, but there was little choice. Some people took sleeping bags that were the forebears of modern designs, sewn from sheepskin or reindeer hide. You crawled in there completely, tightened the drawstring at the neck, and you were in a cocoon. Warm, but impossible to get out of quickly. If the train braked suddenly, you risked sliding off the bench and flopping on the floor like a grub. And the windows. Those winter windows deserve their own poem. When the air outside was bitter, and the carriage had even a trace of warmth from the stove and the passenger's breath, condensation formed on the glass. That moisture froze almost at once, turning into a thick sheet of hoarfrost. By the middle of the night, the panes were covered with ice patterns so dense you could not see a thing outside. Beautiful, without question, but utterly impractical, because it meant moisture from the air was settling on the cold surfaces. If it settled on the windows, it also settled on the walls and ceiling. By morning, the carriage was clammy. Clothing dampened, hair grew moist, bedding became sticky with condensed water. That dampness crept into the bones. Many passengers returned from winter night journeys ill. Bronchitis, inflammation of the lungs, rheumatism. The elderly and children suffered most. Doctors warned that winter travel by train required special caution. But what else could people do if they had to travel? The approach to winter heating differed noticeably between America and Europe. Europeans, the English especially, endured the cold with a sort of stoicism. Their philosophy was that a gentleman did not complain about discomfort. For a long time, English railway companies resisted installing heating. Their response was essentially, put on a warm coat and stop whining. Only after a string of loud scandals and court cases did they begin, slowly, to fit stoves. Americans were more pragmatic. They realized quickly that frozen passengers were bad for business. By the end of the 1840s, American railways were already experimenting with different heating systems. Steam heating was tried, with steam from the locomotive piped through to the carriages. It worked, but required a complicated network of pipes and valves. Braziers with hot coals under the carriage floor were another attempt, risky, but effective. Russia went its own way entirely. With far harsher winters, the approach was more radical. Some carriages had 2 stoves, one at the front and one at the back, and the conductor was appointed to ensure both fires burned evenly. There, too, innovators devised double window frames, a predecessor of the modern insulated unit. Between the frames, they packed wool or moss for thermal insulation. It helped, but only to a degree. There were also curious, almost comic incidents. One winter, on the Moscow to Nizhny Novgorod line, third-class passengers froze so badly that they began to break the wooden benches and feed them into the stove. The conductor tried to stop them, but no one listened. By the end of the journey, not a single bench remained intact. Everyone sat on the floor, but at least it was warm. The company filed a complaint, yet the tribunal ruled in the passengers' favor, deciding that if a railway could not provide adequate heating, passengers had the right to take measures to preserve their health. By the beginning of the 1850s, the situation was finally beginning to improve. More capable stoves with adjustable draft appeared. People invented thermal insulation for the walls, slipping a layer of felt or cork between the outer and inner sheathing. Windows were made tighter, gaps were caulked. Yet true winter comfort on the rails only arrived with the advent of genuine sleeping cars. And then a man stepped onto the stage who changed everything. George Mortimer Pullman, a carpenter from New York, turned the nightmarish experience of overnight railway travel into something relatively civilized. George Mortimer Pullman was an ordinary carpenter from the state of New York. Not an aristocrat, not an engineer with a university degree, not a wealthy industrialist, just a craftsman who knew wood. Then, in 1854, the 33-year-old Pullman set out on an overnight journey from Buffalo to Westfield. The trip was meant to take the whole night. He had bought a first-class ticket, expecting a measure of comfort. What he found in the car made him so indignant that he resolved to do something about it. Imagine paying a decent sum for first class and getting a hard bench with leather upholstery, a dim lamp, and the company of snoring strangers. All night, Pullman tossed and turned, trying to find a comfortable position. His neck grew stiff, his back ached, and by morning he was exhausted and furious. Then an idea struck him. What if you could truly lie down? What if there were proper beds, like at home? It sounds simple, but in the 1850s, it was a revolutionary notion. Railway companies believed that because a car was moving, passengers should sit. Lying down in public transport was considered indecent, almost obscene. This was not a bedroom. This was a train. Pullman thought differently. He reasoned that if a person paid for an overnight trip, that person had the right to sleep, and sleeping while seated was impossible. Therefore, beds were necessary. Logical, absolutely. But how to fit beds into a narrow car that by day had to seat passengers? For the next 10 years, Pullman wrestled with the problem, experimenting and drafting plans. He moved to Chicago, opened a small workshop, and began building prototypes. The first attempts were clumsy. He converted ordinary passenger coaches by installing folding cots. The results were bulky and awkward. Cots fell onto passengers' heads, mechanisms jammed, everything creaked and wobbled. Railway companies watched these experiments with skepticism. Why complicate things? People already traveled. Then, in 1863, an event occurred that changed attitudes toward comfort on trains. President Abraham Lincoln was shot, and his body needed to be borne from Washington to Springfield across the country. The funeral train was to travel slowly and solemnly, stopping in every major city. The journey took more than a week, and the government commissioned a special mourning car, luxurious and worthy of a president. Pullman received the order. He produced a masterpiece. The car was upholstered in black velvet and trimmed with silver tassels and draperies. Most important, it contained a real bed for the coffin and folding sleeping places for the attendants. The funeral train passed through half the country, and thousands of people saw that car. They saw that travel could be different, that one could journey with comfort and dignity. After Lincoln's funeral, railway companies began to approach Pullman. They wanted such cars. They wanted to astonish their passengers. In 1865, only months after the end of the Civil War, Pullman unveiled his first real sleeping car for regular service. He called it the Pioneer. It was, in truth, a revolution on wheels. Step inside that car, and you see what astonished contemporaries. By day, the Pioneer looked like an ordinary passenger coach, only a touch more luxurious. Soft velvet seats, polished wood, mirrors, gas lamps with frosted shades. One could sit, read, converse. But in the evening, the magic began. The conductor, who would come to be called a porter, started the transformation of the car. Please like and subscribe to Lectures Under the Moon. The seatbacks folded down and locked together, turning two opposite seats into a single, wide, lower berth. From the wall, a second berth slid out. It was hung on hinges and during the day was lifted up and hidden. The result was a two-tier sleeping bay. For each berth, the porter laid out bedding, sheets, a blanket, a pillow, real bedding, white, starched, fresh. For people who had slept for 10 years on bare benches in trains, this was a miracle. But it did not end there. Around each berth, the porter hung curtains, heavy dark green drapes that carved out a private space. You could pull the curtain closed and you were no longer in the general carriage, but in your own little sleeping capsule. Nobody could see you undress, prepare for bed, or snore. It was a luxury that had not existed before on trains. The public reaction was varied. Some passengers were delighted. Finally, one could get a proper night's sleep, lie down, stretch out to full height, and be covered with a proper blanket. These people were prepared to pay 3 times more for that comfort. And they did. A ticket for a sleeping car cost as much as a first-class ticket, plus an additional charge for a sleeping place. It was expensive, but worth it. Others were outraged. Conservative Victorians found the very idea of sleeping on a train indecent. They were especially scandalized by the notion that men and women would sleep in the same carriage, even if separated by curtains. "This is immoral," churchmen wrote in the newspapers. "It corrupts morals," ran the echo from the guardians of public decency. Some suggested banning sleeping cars as a threat to public morality. Pullman, however, proved not only an inventor, but a shrewd businessman. He solved the problem decisively, creating separate women's sections in the carriage. One half of the car was allotted to ladies and to families with children, the other half to men traveling alone. A locked door stood between the sections, and a porter was on duty to ensure that no one crossed the boundary. That reassured the moralists. Well, more or less reassured them. There were also technical problems. The first passengers in sleeping cars did not know how to use the berths. People tried to climb into the upper berth with their boots on and their travel coats. They fell, tangled in the curtains, forgot to lower the safety net, and tumbled down from the upper shelf in the night straight onto the lower berth where another passenger was sleeping. It became necessary to print instructions and hang them in the cars. The notice was a little comic. It explained, in a solemn tone, "Before lying down, remove your shoes and outer garments. Fold your belongings neatly and place them in the special pocket behind the headboard. When climbing to the upper berth, use the ladder. Do not attempt to jump up. Remember safety. Lower the protective net along the edge of the berth so you do not roll off during sleep. If you need to go down during the night, light a candle. Do not walk in the dark."
Porters are a separate story. Pullman realized that simply installing berths was not enough. There needed to be someone to fold out the beds, lay the sheets, help passengers get settled, and keep order in the car. He hired porters, specially trained attendants who worked through the night. Their uniform consisted of a white tunic with gold buttons, trousers with braided stripes, and white gloves. They were to be always attentive, always ready to help. An interesting fact: almost all the porters in Pullman cars were African American. Many were former slaves or the children of former slaves. The job of porter offered them a chance at respectable pay. Pullman paid fairly well, but demanded iron discipline and impeccable service. The porters became the face of the company. It was they who created the atmosphere of comfort and care that set Pullman cars apart from ordinary ones.
Sleeping in a Pullman car was still not the same as sleeping at home, but it was incomparable to the wooden benches of earlier days. The berth, to be sure, was narrow, about 60 centimeters wide. Turning over was difficult. If you lay on your back, you often remained in that position until morning because there was not much room to roll onto your side. The clearance between the lower and the upper berth was about 60 centimeters, which made the space feel compact, but, with the curtains drawn and the porter's attentions, remarkably private and civilized. You could not sit, only lying down was allowed. But these were trifles compared with what had come before. The clack of the wheels did not vanish. The car still thundered over rail joints, still bumped and rocked. Yet, when you lay horizontal, that shaking was easier to bear. Your body relaxed, your muscles let go, and the little curtains created the illusion of a protected space, a tiny, private world. For many, it was easier to fall asleep inside that dark capsule, cut off from the rest of the car. Pullman had also thought through heating. Instead of the dangerous little stoves, he used steam heating. From the locomotive, hot steam ran through a network of pipes to radiators fitted along the car walls. The temperature was fairly even. There was neither the stove's tropical heat nor an Arctic chill by the doors. In winter, a Pullman sleeping car was warm and relatively comfortable. By 1870, Pullman cars were running across America. His company, Pullman Palace Car Company, became a giant of the railroad industry. He did not sell cars to the railroads. He leased them, keeping control over the quality of service. Every car belonged to Pullman. Every porter was his employee. That arrangement guaranteed a uniform, high standard from coast to coast. Europeans at first looked at American novelties with skepticism. They had their own system, compartment coaches with closed sections. Gradually, Pullman's ideas began to seep into the old world, though Europeans reshaped them to fit their own habits and sensibilities. We will return to that a little later. Friends, a small request. If you liked this, support Lectures Under the Moon with a like. It helps the channel grow. For now, remember that a Pullman car wasn't just a technological innovation, it was a social revolution. For the first time in history, a person of any means could buy a ticket and have the chance to sleep almost as they would at home. Not on an aristocratic canopy bed, of course, but on a real berth with linens and a pillow. It was, in short, the democratization of comfort. That phrase sounds grand, yet in practice the reality was more interesting and more complicated. When you lock 30 strangers in one car for the night, hand them beds, and ask them to sleep, a genuine social drama unfolds. The sleeping car became a small society with its own rules, taboos, conflicts, and astonishing stories. The evening ritual is the place to begin. Imagine the train pulling out at 8 o'clock.
Passengers take their places, chat, read newspapers. About 9 o'clock, the porter starts his rounds with a polite question. Is it time to prepare your berth? This was a delicate way of finding out who was ready, because transforming the car was noisy and took time. You could not unfold one bed without disturbing the neighbors. Usually, families with small children and elderly passengers were the first to ask. The porter began with their sections. He would ask passengers to stand, then, in a few minutes, turn 2 seats into a lower berth, pull out the upper berth, spread the bedding, and hang the curtains. The passengers came back to find a ready-made bed, a little piece of magic. But where to change clothes? There were no private dressing cubicles. A tiny lavatory at the end of the car existed, but queues formed, so most people changed behind their berth curtains.
And that turned into an acrobatic performance. Try taking off a corset or changing a shirt in a space 60 centimeters wide and 60 centimeters high while the train rocks. Elbows keep knocking into the walls, your head bumps the upper berth, your feet tangle in clothing. For women it was especially difficult. Dresses with bustles, laced corsets, many layered petticoats. All of it had to be removed, folded and packed into a travel trunk. Many ladies brought special night garments, loose robes or roomy nightshirts that allowed them to appear decently from behind the curtain if needed, but dressing remained intimate and awkward. For men it was a little simpler. Remove the jacket, unbutton the collar, loosen the tie, and you could sleep. Yet that small, practical difference did not erase the new social choreography the sleeping car required. A ritual of courtesy, of shared space, and of small negotiations that turned the mundane act of going to bed into something oddly communal and memorable. The most practical ones slept fully dressed, simply taking off their shoes and waistcoat. But the gentlemen who cared for propriety changed into nightshirts and nightcaps. Yes, in the 19th century, adult men slept in nightcaps. It was considered hygienic and proper. Now imagine the soundscape of a night sleeping car. It was a true cacophony. At the base, a monotonous clack of wheels, rhythmic and lulling. On top of that came creaks. The wooden car squeaked at every joint. The walls creaked, the floor creaked, the ceiling creaked, the berths creaked. At every curve, at every acceleration or braking, the car groaned like a living creature. 30 people in the same space, many of them snoring. Someone softly whistled. Someone made a loud rumbling sound. Someone snuffled and grunted. It became an entire symphony of snores in different keys. The curtains, of course, isolated you visually, but they did nothing acoustically. Everything could be heard. Those who could not fall asleep because of a neighbor's snore began to cough, knock on the wall, or rustle a newspaper, hinting to the snorer that he was disturbing others. Sometimes it helped. The snorer would wake, roll onto his side, and the snoring would subside. But after half an hour, everything would begin again. The most desperate would call the porter with a request to wake the snoring neighbor. The porter would delicately part the curtain and politely say, "Sir, could you please turn onto your side? Your sleep is disturbing other passengers." Night trips to the lavatory formed a separate chapter in the car's social life. The lavatory stood at the far end of the car. To reach it, you had to climb down from your berth, step out from behind the curtain, and walk through the whole car along the narrow aisle between berths. The lighting was dim. Only 1 or 2 lamps burned low. You went by touch, holding the handrail. The train rocked, feet slipped, curtains swayed, and unpleasant sounds drifted from the compartments. Snoring, murmuring in sleep, the creak of berths.
Imagine a woman in a long nightshirt trying to walk that path without stumbling, without brushing the curtains, without waking fellow travelers. It required skill. Many preferred to endure until morning rather than make a nocturnal excursion. Especially women. They felt embarrassed to show themselves in nightclothes before strangers. The lavatory itself was tiny. A wash basin, a toilet, a hook for a towel, and that was all. There was no room to turn around. Often there was a line. Early in the morning, around 6 or 7 o'clock, as people began to wake, a queue would form for the lavatory. They stood yawning, in dressing gowns and nightshirts, waiting their turn. Sometimes men gallantly let the ladies go first. Sometimes quarrels started over who had been there first. The porters acted not only as service staff, but also as a kind of peacemaker and counselor.
They smoothed out conflicts, calmed the displeased, helped find compromises. If someone complained about a neighbor's snoring, the porter could offer to move them to a vacant berth at the other end of the car. If someone was cold, he brought an extra blanket. If someone could not sleep, he fetched a glass of warm milk from the buffet. A good porter knew his passengers. He remembered who liked their berth made early, who preferred the upper bunk, who asked for an extra pillow. He woke passengers at the right time, some an hour before arrival, some half an hour. He would rap on the partition by the berth and quietly say, "Good morning, Mr. Johnson. 40 minutes to Pittsburgh. Would you like some tea?" Tips for porters were an important part of their income. Officially, they were paid little. The main money they earned came from tips. For that reason, porters tried to please every passenger. They were attentive and obliging. At the end of a trip, grateful passengers would give the porter $1 or $2. In those days, that was a respectable sum. The generous gave more. The stingy gave nothing, which was considered bad form. There were also odd incidents. Once, in a sleeping car on the Chicago to New York line, a passenger in the upper berth forgot about the safety net in the middle of the night, turned over in his sleep, and slid down right onto an elderly lady sleeping on the lower berth. The screams woke the entire car. The lady was in shock. The man was horrified at what he had done. The porter had to calm everyone down, offer the upper berth to the lady, and explain to the man the importance of using the safety net. In another case, a young couple on their honeymoon had been assigned 2 adjacent lower berths. During the night, they opened their curtains and spoke softly across the narrow passage between them. A romantic whispering began. Yet, in a sleeping car, the acoustics worked against privacy. A whisper carried clearer than ordinary speech. Before long, the whole car had involuntarily become witness to their tender confessions. In the morning, the lovers stepped out blushing like lobsters amid the giggles of fellow passengers. There were also touching moments. An old man traveling to a funeral for his pig could not sleep all night and wept quietly behind his curtain. The porter noticed, brought him a mug of hot tea, sat with him and spoke for a while. By morning, the old man had calmed and even managed a short nap. Afterwards, he wrote a letter to the Pullman Company, thanking the porter for his sensitivity and humanity. Children in sleeping cars were both a source of joy and trouble. Little ones loved the odd, swinging beds and treated the journey like an adventure. But putting them to sleep was never easy. They fidgeted, slipped out from behind curtains, ran along the aisle. Parents had to hiss, "Quiet! People are sleeping!" Sometimes children fell from the upper berths, and sometimes they became sick from the motion. Porters kept a supply of mint candies especially for children, partly to soothe them and partly to help with motion sickness. At dawn, the sleeping car woke up slowly. First to stir were the early birds, business travelers who needed to be ready at arrival. They dressed quietly, went to the washroom,
and returned already buttoned and combed. Then the main body of passengers woke. The morning bustle began. Queues for the washroom, packing, arranging luggage. The porter moved through the car, folding the berths back into seats and removing the bedding. In 20 minutes, the car had reverted to its daytime form. Passengers sat on the benches, sipped morning coffee from thermoses, and watched the approaching town through the windows, as if the nocturnal transformation had never happened. Yet the tired faces betrayed a harder night. Sleeping in a sleeping car, even with a bed and bedding, was not the same as at home. It was a particular kind of sleep, light, broken, and alert. You hovered constantly between sleep and wakefulness, hearing every creak, every noise, every stop. Still, it was 100 times better than spending the whole night on a hard bench. People learned to sleep under these conditions and grew accustomed to the particularities of the sleeping car. Interesting. The Europeans took a very different path. They rejected the American open layout with curtains and had their own ideas about how a sleeping car should look. Those differences reveal a great deal about cultural contrasts between America and Europe and deserve a separate discussion. Europeans were obsessed with privacy. If Americans felt that curtains provided sufficient personal space, Europeans demanded real walls, real doors, and real locks. The notion of sleeping in the same room with 30 strangers, even behind curtains, struck them as barbaric. "We are not American farmers to sleep in a common barn," went the gist of discussions among European railway magnates. Hence, Europe moved toward compartment cars. The carriage was divided into separate closed compartments, or coupes. Each coupe had its own door with a lock, its own window, and its own space. Depending on class, a coupe accommodated from 2 to 6 people. This was a philosophy of enclosed, protected space, set against the American ideal of openness. Step into a typical European first-class coupe of the late 1870s. A small room of about 2 by 2.5 meters. Along the walls, 2 soft divans, upholstered in leather or velvet, faced one another. Above each divan, a folding shelf held luggage. A window with heavy curtains provided daylight or shade. A gas lamp sat under a glass globe. And, most importantly, a door that closed from the inside with a bolt. In the evening, when it was time to sleep, the sofas were transformed into beds, the backs folded down, the seats pulled forward, and 2 wide berths appeared. If 4 people shared a compartment, 2 more berths folded down from the wall above. The conductor brought bedding, mattresses, and pillows. Passengers either made their own beds or asked the conductor for help. The chief difference from the American approach was complete privacy. Close the door, and you were in your own small world. You could undress as you pleased, without worrying that someone might peep through a slit in a curtain. You could switch the light on or off whenever you wanted. You could snore to your heart's content if the others in the compartment were your fellow travelers, family, or had agreed to tolerate one another. There was, however, the other side of the coin. If you traveled alone, strangers could be assigned to your compartment. Then the lottery began. If you were lucky, you would get pleasant, polite people to talk about weather and politics with, and afterwards you would quietly retire to your berths. If you were unlucky, you might be trapped for the whole night with a drunk, a tedious chatterbox, or someone with appalling habits. There was nowhere to go. The door was locked, the train was rushing on, and the next station could be hours away. Curious and unpleasant stories circulated. Single women were afraid to travel in compartments with unfamiliar men. Railway companies tried to address the problem by creating special women's compartments, marked with signs reading, "Ladies Only." Men were strictly forbidden to enter, but there were never enough of these compartments, so sometimes women still had to ride in mixed sections. In such cases, they kept their travel dresses on and slept dressed, staying on guard. Men, too, were sometimes wary of their companions. In the 19th century, trains became favorite hunting grounds for pickpockets and swindlers. These thieves bought tickets, sat beside wealthy passengers, wormed themselves into confidence with conversation, and at night, when the victim fell asleep, emptied pockets or even laced a glass of wine with a sleeping draught. Newspapers regularly carried warnings. Do not accept treats from strangers on the train. Sleep with your travel bag under your head. Lock your compartment from the inside. Second class in Europe was more modest. Compartments were smaller and the sofas firmer. There was no velvet, merely plain leather or even wooden benches with thin cushions. Yet it remained a separate, enclosed space. 6 people might occupy a compartment, berths folded into 3 tiers. It was cramped but bearable, and, crucially, the door could be locked. Third class often went without sleeping berths altogether, the same hard benches as before. A compartment offered only the illusion of privacy. 8 people crammed into a small space, sleeping however they could, some on the bench, some on the floor, some half-sitting. Still, they were separated from the rest of the world by a door, and that meant something. Now, winter and heating. Europeans faced the same difficulties as Americans, but solved them in their own way. The compartment system made it hard to install steam heating. Pipes had to be run into every compartment, radiators fitted, and airtight seals maintained. It was expensive and complicated. For a long time, many European trains relied on hot water bottles and portable braziers. Before departure, the conductor would bring a metal box of hot coals into each compartment and place it under the seat. It would warm the compartment for about 5 to 6 hours. At stations, the conductor would replace cooled boxes with fresh, hot ones. The system worked, but it was dangerous. Coals sometimes spilled and fires began. The Germans were the first to devise a more effective solution. They used special metal heaters filled with sodium acetate. When heated, this substance stored heat and then released it slowly. The heater would be charged with boiling water at the station and could warm a compartment for up to 12 hours. It was safe and efficient, though the devices were heavy, about 15 kilograms each, and had to be carried from compartment to compartment. The French experimented with electric heaters. As early as the years around the turn of the century, some lines had cars equipped with dynamos that generated electricity from the rotation of the wheels. That electricity was used for lighting and heating, but the system was temperamental and often broke down. The English, faithful to their traditions, resisted installing heating longer than anyone else. An English gentleman is not afraid of the cold, their philosophy declared. Yet, after a string of public scandals and complaints in Parliament from passengers who had frozen on board, they had to give way. By the end of the 19th century, even English trains had been fitted with steam heating. Ventilation in winter remained a perpetual headache. 6 people sat in a compartment, breathing, giving off heat and carbon dioxide. The window was nailed shut. Outside, the frost. The air quickly grew stale and oppressive, and a headache would begin to throb. If someone opened the window, an icy wind rushed in. All the warm air vanished in an instant. Everyone began to shiver. The same drama played out in every compartment. One passenger felt hot and wanted fresh air. Another was freezing and opposed any draft outright. Negotiations began, arguments, compromises. They agreed to open the window for 5 minutes every hour, or to crack it only a finger's width, or, if the coach had a corridor, to open a window into the corridor instead. Engineers tried to fix the problem mechanically. They designed ventilation valves in the compartment walls, small apertures with shutters through which air could circulate without admitting a raw blast. They devised heat recovery systems, where the outgoing warm air heated the incoming cold air. Yet all these solutions were imperfect and often failed. By the end of the 19th century, two clearly distinct schools of railway comfort had emerged. The American model was open, democratic, with porters and curtains on the berths, with communal spaces where people mixed. The European model was closed and private, with compartments and doors, where each traveler occupied a tiny, private world. Both systems had strengths and weaknesses. The American car offered more social life and interaction. A porter was always near and ready to help. But there was less privacy, more noise, and everyone overheard each other. The European compartment provided complete privacy. You could do as you pleased, but if your companions were unpleasant, you were sealed with them for the night. If you needed anything, you had to go into the corridor and seek the conductor. Russian trains, by the way, borrowed the European compartment system, but added their own particularities. The compartments were roomier, and they placed real samovars for tea. The habit of long conversations with fellow travelers became part of Russian railway culture. In our compartments, people did not simply remain silent and sleep. They got acquainted, shared food, told stories. By the beginning of the 20th century, both systems had reached a high degree of perfection. Luxurious sleeping cars appeared with private cabins, with showers, with hot water, and with electric lighting. Dining cars arrived, lounge cars, library cars. Travel in a sleeping car had shifted from trial to pleasure. The golden age of railway sleep had begun. It was the era of legendary trains like the Orient Express and the Trans-Siberian Express of the 20th century. An age when the train was not merely a means of transport, but a way of life, a symbol of progress and the romance of travel. It is worth telling the story of that golden age at greater length. By the end of the 19th century, railway companies had learned a simple truth. People were willing to pay not only to get from point A to point B, they were willing to pay for an experience, for an impression, for a form of comfort that would be remembered. Thus began the era later called the Golden Age of Railways, when the sleeping car transformed from a utilitarian vehicle into a work of art on wheels. 1901. A world exposition opened in Paris, and one of the centerpieces was a mock-up of a car from the new Simplon Orient Express. Visitors queued to step inside and gasp with admiration, because this was no longer a carriage in the conventional sense. It was a floating hotel, a palace on rails, a marvel of engineering and design. Step inside such a car. A broad corridor laid with a thick carpet that muffled footsteps. Walls faced with redwood panels inlaid with mother-of-pearl. The ceiling adorned with ornamental plasterwork. Along the corridor, doors opened into private compartments. Not merely little compartments, but genuine cabins. Each door bore a polished brass plate with a number, shined until it caught the light. Open the door to a luxury class cabin, and you stepped into a space the size of a decent hotel room. Along one wall there was a wide sofa upholstered in damask silk. Above it, a mirror in a gilded frame reflected the lamps. At the window stood a small table with a marble top, and upon it a table lamp crowned with a stained glass shade. In the corner, a washstand with a mixing tap supplied both hot and cold running water. Real hot water on a train? It felt like a kind of miracle. In the evening, the attendant transformed the sofa into a full bed, broad, fitted with a genuine coil spring mattress, dressed in Egyptian cotton sheets, with goose-down pillows and a cashmere blanket.
2 people could sleep without elbowing each other, without risking a tumble to the floor. Such luxury was unimaginable to the passengers of the hard benches of the 1840s. Yet the marvel lay in the details. Every cabin had an electric call bell to summon the attendant. Press the button, and within a minute, someone would knock at the door, ready to grant any request. Tea, coffee, sandwiches, a newspaper, everything could be brought right into the compartment. Electric lighting in each cabin came with adjustable brightness. One could read by a bright lamp or dim the light to create an intimate atmosphere. Ventilation had been designed with equal care. Special valves in the walls supplied a constant flow of fresh air, pre-warmed or pre-cooled according to the season. In winter, the cabins were warm, but never stuffy. In summer, they felt cool without being chilly. At last, engineers had addressed the cursed problem of stale air and condensation. Heating was now steam throughout. Steam, sent from the locomotive through insulated pipes, fed radiators in every cabin. Temperature was regulated by valves. A passenger could make a compartment warmer or cooler to suit personal taste. No more dangerous stoves, no hot bricks or cumbersome foot warmers, only comforting, even heat. But the Golden Age was about more than technical novelties. A particular atmosphere, a spirit of an era, wrapped those journeys. Traveling in a luxurious sleeping car was an event. People prepared for it, dreamed about it, took pride in it. Ladies ordered special travel wardrobes from the best dressmakers. Gentlemen purchased new calfskin trunks with brass locks, because on such a train it mattered to look the part. On the platform before the departure of the Orient Express, a crowd of gawkers would gather, watching the elegant passengers climb the steps into the cars. They admired women in wide-brimmed hats feathered with plumes, and men in bowler hats carrying canes. They envied those who could afford such travel. A ticket in a luxury sleeping car cost as much as a month's wages for a skilled worker. The restaurant car was the social heart of the train. A long saloon, tables laid with white cloths, silver cutlery, crystal glasses. Waiters in tailcoats carried plates of French cuisine from a real kitchen aboard the train. Yes, the train had proper stoves, ovens, and pantries. Chefs prepared oysters, foie gras, game roasts, soufflés. The wine list offered hundreds of choices. At dinner, strangers made acquaintances, exchanged visiting cards, began romances. Diplomats debated politics, businessmen struck deals, writers found material. Agatha Christie wrote Murder on the Orient Express after traveling on that very train. The atmosphere of the luxurious car, the motley company, the confinement of the journey provided an ideal setting for a mystery. After dinner, passengers retired to the lounge car, where soft armchairs, sofas, and low tables waited for card games. One might play bridge, read, smoke a cigar, sip cognac, or engage in leisurely conversation. Some trains even included library cars, shelves filled with hundreds of volumes in several languages. Other cars housed pianos, and, on many nights, a small concert. Then, at around 10 or 11 o'clock, passengers would withdraw to their cabins. The attendants had already prepared everything. Beds folded out, linens smoothed, bedside lamps left aglow. The train settled into its nocturnal rhythm, the steady click of the wheels a soft companion to sleep. All that remained was to undress, lie down, and fall asleep. And sleep in that compartment truly resembled sleep at home. A wide bed, a soft mattress, quality sheets. The wheel clack outside the window became a lullaby. The gentle rocking of the carriage moved you in a soothing rhythm. Of course, not everyone could afford the luxury cars, but even a second-class compartment on a good train was comfortable. 2 to 4 berths, clean linens, decent ventilation, heating. Nightscapes flashed past the glass.
City lights, the silhouettes of mountains, endless fields. You lay warm and snug, knowing that in the morning you might wake in another country, perhaps at the far end of a continent. The Trans-Siberian Main Line offered its own version of luxury. A journey from Moscow to Vladivostok took more than a week. It was not simply a transfer. It was a life-length adventure. Cars were adapted for long trips, spacious compartments where one could not only sleep, but live. Some travelers brought whole wardrobes, books, even musical instruments. In the sleeping cars of the Trans-Siberian, there was a particular atmosphere. The long voyage produced a kind of temporary community. Passengers met during the first days, and by the end of the trip became almost friends. Together they drank tea from glasses set in metal holders. Together they watched the boundless Siberian plains. Together they endured stops at tiny stations where you could step out, stretch your legs, and buy pies from local vendors. Winter on the Trans-Siberian was especially snug. Outside raged bitter frost, blizzards, a white infinity. Inside the car, it was warm. A lamp burned, a tea urn hissed. Conductors in fur vests walked the corridor, checking that the radiators were working properly so passengers would be comfortable. It was a remarkable sensation to rush across a frozen continent inside a warm cocoon of civilization. But the Golden Age could not last forever. The First World War, then the Great Depression, then the Second World War, delivered heavy blows to luxurious trains. People stopped traveling for pleasure. Trains became means of evacuation, troop transport, refugee carriage. Luxury cars were requisitioned, rebuilt, and many were simply destroyed. After the wars, railways tried to restore former splendor, yet the world had changed. Airplanes carried passengers faster.
Automobiles offered freedom of movement. Trains began to lose in speed and convenience. Luxurious sleeping cars became exotic museum pieces. Today, we live in an era of high-speed trains. Japanese Shinkansen, French TGV, Chinese high-speed sets race along at up to 300 kilometers per hour. Modern sleeping cars are fitted with air conditioning, televisions, power outlets for charging gadgets. There are shower cabins, toilets with bidets, and Wi-Fi. Technically, they are near perfection, but something has been lost. The romance of slow travel has faded, the unhurried passage when the journey itself mattered more than the destination. The custom of long conversations with fellow travelers, when you learned strangers' stories, has dwindled. The sense of adventure that a sleeping carriage once offered has been diminished. The first passengers of night trains in the 1840s thought sleeping in a moving coach was torment and trial. Travelers of the Golden Age at the beginning of the 20th century believed it was luxury and delight. We, modern travelers, take it for granted. Sit down, lie down, sleep, wake, disembark. Everything is simple and fast. Yet if you pause to think, what a marvel it is to fall asleep in one place and awaken in another, to travel through the night, across cities and countries, while remaining in a warm bed. Our ancestors dreamed of such things. For them, it would have been magic, enchantment, a fairy tale. For us, it is ordinary. Perhaps it is worth remembering. Those hard benches and kerosene lamps, the dangerous pot-belly stoves and hot bricks at the feet. Remember the inventiveness of Pullman and the labor of thousands of porters. Remember the luxurious cars of the Orient Express and the cozy Trans-Siberian compartment. All of this is part of our shared history. This is the story of how humanity tamed distance, learned to sleep while moving,
and turned discomfort into comfort. Who knows? Perhaps in 100 years, our descendants will smile, remembering how we slept on trains in the early 21st century, how we rejoiced at air conditioning and Wi-Fi, and how we believed that was the height of perfection. They will have magnetic levitation trains racing at 1,000 kilometers per hour, with sleeping capsules where artificial gravity creates the sensation of absolute stillness. They will write a history of how their ancestors learned to sleep in primitive iron carriages, riding on steel rails. The circle will close, because progress does not stop. Yet one thing remains unchanged: the human need for comfort, for warmth, for a sense of safety while we sleep. Whether we find ourselves on a hard bench of the 19th century, in an elegant compartment of the early 20th, or in a sleek, high-speed train of our own time, we remain the same people, seeking rest and peace after a long day. There is something deeply human and quietly moving in that continuity. Good night, and may trains visit your dreams. Those romantic ones that slip slowly through the night, their windows like constellations, the steady rhythm of wheels under them. Those are the trains that still carry the spirit of the great age of railways. With you was Daniel Hayes. See you in the next episode of Lectures Under the Moon. Please subscribe and like.